Hello, everyone. Thank you for joining me today on this latest episode of Rod and Ring Ancient Near East meets Modern West. I am your host, Samuel David, and today I am joined by special guest, Sara Mastros. Welcome, Sara. Thank you so much for joining me today.
Oh, thank you for having me. I'm excited about it.
I'm excited too. We're going to do a deep dive or semi deep dive or even a shallow dive, whatever you want to call it,
Come around a
into
little.
into the topic of Ereshkigal in the PGM, who is who is most notable for her role in the descent myth of Inanna, the descent of
Mhm.
Ishtar for the Akkadian-speaking people. But
All those
curiously,
Acadians out there in the audience today,
all
shout
those
out.
crazy Akkadians and the Babylonians too. But curiously, we also find her making her way into the Greek Magical Papyri and being conflated with Hecate and Persephone as Hecate, Persephone, Ereshkigal.
Yeah.
Tell
So,
us
yeah,
all
I
about
think I think it's really interesting. First, because I think until you sort of get into studying it, I think it's easy to understand like the ancient world to be like one thing. But it's so many different cultures and like thousands and thousands of years. Like there is so much time between when like we think of Ereshkigal as being like active in the world under that name and the Greek magical papyri, which are late antiquity, right? Like the Greek magical papyri generally are maybe like 200, maybe 400 BCE at the earliest, right? So it's really fascinating that we see Ereshkigal, particularly because like we don't see other Mesopotamian gods, at least certainly not as prominently. Like maybe there are little hints of them.
that is exactly something that has always puzzled me, especially since we have deities like Inanna or Ishtar who
Mm-hmm.
are powerhouses in their,
Right.
in
And you
everything
would
about them.
really think that Ishtar in particular, like, is in some ways like a much more like mainstream like
Yes,
god than
exactly.
Ishtar. So it's weird. So here's what I think it is. I think it's a couple of factors. One, I think that Ishtar, like I am not saying that Ishtar and Aphrodite and Venus are identical, but I am saying that that god has a body and its body is the planet Venus, right? And so I think that in the ancient world, at least in Greece, right? I feel like the only part of the ancient world I feel even remotely qualified to speak about is Greece. But at least in Greece, like they would have just called her Aphrodite. Like when they're talking about Ishtar, like they definitely just would have used that word. And similarly in Rome, they would just say Venus because like they would not have acknowledged that they were different in any way. So I think it's partly that like planetary gods sort of like the name changes more easily because they are in some ways like more similar. Like there's a particularly from like Ishtar to Aphrodite, I feel like there's a very clear sort of like spectrum, right?
Yeah,
Where Ishtar
definitely.
turns into like Astarte, turns into like Aphrodite, and you can watch her be diminished as patriarchy gets harder and harder, right?
Yeah.
Ishtar is like the
She
great
gets
queen of heaven and earth, like the mistress of war and thunder. You know, the Greeks had a real penchant where they would just like show up, meet a god for like 5 minutes and slap a name on it.
yeah.
Right. And a lot of times it's like a political flex in a way that I didn't fully understand until I was in Greece. So like I feel like Artemis at Browron, right, where she's like the bear who initiates young girls,
hmm
and like Artemis at Eleusis, where she's Hecate,
Yeah.
are are quite different for each other. And then I've never been to Ephesus, but like Artemis of Ephesus, if you hadn't told me that that was called Artemis, I never would have known that because that is obviously not Artemis. Like it's not the way Artemis is understood in Greece. Like they're just slapping these names on. Like that Artemis at Ephesus, who was also called Aphrodite of the East sometimes.
hmm
Like that's very clearly in that like chain of transmission,
Right.
right? But it's honestly so far removed from anything we would reasonably call Artemis, and it's not clear to me that anybody in Ephesus called her that.
Exactly.
I think like
That's
the
the
colonial
conundrum
name.
that we have here.
Yeah, and I think similarly, Athena in particular, that name gets slapped all over stuff as an Athenian, like the city of Athens political flex, right? So like there's a temple to Athena of Phaya on the island of Aegina that I was at. And like, I mean, I'm not trying to tell people their business, but that is obviously Hecate. Like, first of all, just having been in that temple, no question. But also, like, if you read the lore of Aphaya, right? A goddess that like we don't know anything about except
Mhm.
the temple. Like she's also called Brito Mardis, who is like a face of Hecate that like invents fishing nets to grossly
Interesting.
oversimplify. Like it's clearly Hecate, and like it doesn't get called like that goddess, that emanation, that place is not associated with Athena until quite late in history when Athens conquers it and is like, fuck you. Ours now. And so like I think sometimes like that's part of what I think is happening when you say like it's splitting into the spaces. Because I think it is wrong to say, sorry that I'm like, well, actually,
Actually,
this
oh,
is
you're
a topic
good.
close to my heart in particular. Like Artemis, her worship in Greece is very, very old.
Mhm.
Right? Whereas Aphrodite and Athena are both imported into Greece.
Correct.
I understand Artemis to be like an indigenous goddess in Greece who like slowly changes into who we know. So I don't think it is the case that like Aphrodite turns into Artemis, right? And Athena, I understand to be imported from North Africa, right? From like Libya. I don't know as much about it.
Which would be Carthage, correct?
Yeah,
Yeah.
right. So, but I think she's imported, right? Whereas Artemis, I think, is homegrown. So I think the names get conflated,
Mhm.
right? But more so than that, I'm saying that planetary deities, like the name, like they're more willing to change names. Whereas I feel like underworld gods, they like retain their name longer, right? So even like Inanna and Ishtar, right? We've got these multiple names. And again, I'm not saying they're identical. Like I understand that like not only are Inanna and Ishtar not identical, but like there are thousands of different Inannas and thousands of different Ishtars.
And before all the hard polytheists sound off in the comments, just remember we're going at this from an intellectual, scholarly, and academic point of view. So
Yeah.
no
Well,
feet are getting stomped right now.
to be fair, I'm one of those hard polytheists who is like, well, actually, you right now. So
Yeah.
I will do it. But I'm saying that like I think gods of the underworld in some ways like retain their sense of self across cultures more strongly. And I think it's partly because they're fucking terrifying. And also because they're not like politically valuable, if that makes sense. Like they're not
That makes a lot of
strategic
sense.
in a city, right? And so I think that a lot of times, like those sort of colonial, like, which god is this? Oh no, pick one of these 12 and it can be one of these.
Yeah.
Like, I think that a lot of that is really rooted in like political narrative, right? And particularly in the place. So something that I definitely did not understand until I was in Greece was that like I was getting at this before that like, you know, Artemis of Ephesus and Artemis of Eleusis are almost like you would if you didn't if somebody told you that those were the same goddess, you would never imagine they were the same. They're like unlike each other in every way. But like Artemis of Eleusis and Hecate of Eleusis and Diana of Eleusis are identical. They're just putting the same name on a place, right? So I think when you
Mhm.
have like person of place, right? Like the place name is actually the important one. And underworld gods, interestingly, like in our culture, we don't really think of the underworld as a place, right? We think of it as like a metaphor.
Yeah.
But like, I assure you, having been there, it's a fucking place. I mean, it's a place in the same way. You know, the first time I ever took hallucinogenic mushrooms, in my journal, I wrote, oh, it's called a trip because you're going to a different place. And that seemed really profound at the time, but it really is. And I think anybody who's had that experience of a trip, but also of like a trance journey,
Mhm.
it's not a metaphor really. Like there's a genuine sense of going to a different location,
Yeah.
right? Um,
So,
and
just out of curiosity, only because I like to compare notes when it comes to these things.
yeah,
Um, in your experience during your trip to the underworld, what did the underworld look like to you?
look like is a really I'm gonna skip over the look like part because I will say like I'm not very visual.
Mhm.
For me, here is my general experience of traveling in the underworld, right? Is that first like the sensation of going there, like the magic of catabasis, right? Of underworld descent that there is a genuine physical sensation in the body of downward movement.
Mm-hmm.
Right? That the next characteristic experience for me, but also for people I teach and also people I talk to, right, is that the first place you land, which I call the underworld lobby when I'm teaching beginners, and when I'm preaching, I call it the womb of Mother Earth, right? It's like a dark, enclosed, I mean, not like claustrophobic, but not a big place, right? So I often hear it described as a cave.
Mm-hmm.
But my experience of it is that it's more spherical. Like, it is not like a naturally occurring cave in my experience. It's much closer to being like a bubble, right? And that it doesn't really look like anything, like it's just dark, right? But there is a physical sensation of being there,
Mm-hmm.
right? And that if I listen for it, there is a noise, like a white noise, like a static noise, which I sometimes hear described as a waterfall, but I understand to be like a curtain of neurological freak out. Like your
Mm-hmm.
brain's like, what the fuck? And it's just making white noise somehow. And there's like this curtain of it that you somehow pass through, right? And that on the other side of that, my like sort of senses kind of like click into focus in a way. And when I'm there, so for me, right, that it's not always the same place on the other side of the curtain, or it I think it is always the same place, but it doesn't like seem the same way.
Mm-hmm.
But it almost always is like an outdoor location, which is similar to the ecosystem in which I am, but like in a fully natural state, right? So like when I do it here in Pittsburgh, it's like pretty foresty, right? My experience of the underworld is that it is large and non-Euclidean. And okay, I'm gonna get really nerdy here. I'm gonna say some
Let's
stuff.
do it.
I'm gonna say some stuff that's gonna make me sound really arrogant. Like, I'm better than almost all humans at like understanding the nature of large dimensional, like more than 3-dimensional spaces. But I'm gonna say that like you know, I like my dissertation in mathematics is in the space time, is in the is in analytic topology
Mm-hmm.
of non-metrizable spaces. That is to say, in like what wacky space time that isn't 3-dimensional. In fact, it has an infinite number of dimensions and they're not perpendicular to each other. Like, what shape is that? That's my like I've you know, more than a decade of specialized training in that exact thing. So when I say things like I'm good at navigating in 6 dimensions, it's like I worked hard for that skill.
Yeah.
Right. So my experience of it is that not just is it non-Euclidean, it's non-metrizable. That is to say that like when you really get down to it, you can say that like one thing is near another thing, but you can't really measure distances,
Mm-hmm.
right? Like it has this really complex geometry through which we can navigate, and that like that fundamentally like the distance, the shortest distance between 2 points is not indeed a straight line. Like it's a weird underlying geometry, right? But that there are like regions, and one of those regions that in my experience is relatively close to the like landing pad, like the lobby, that I think my experience of teaching, because this is the thing I teach, so I have like, it's not just my anecdotal experience, it's like a couple hundred people's anecdotal experience reported to me at this point, like is that the land of the dead is quite close to that landing point.
Mm-hmm.
And that there is what Americans at least almost always understand as a river, but sometimes like a low wall. There's like a path that gets you from the landing pad to the land of the dead. And I experience it as a river, unless I'm doing like strictly Mesopotamian work, in which case I usually experience it as like a low stone wall,
Mm-hmm.
and the land is much more deserty.
Interesting.
Right? And then there's like a gate when it's a wall, or like a bridge, right? And there's a geometric configuration of a tall cylindrical thing, which many people say is a tree and some people say is like a tower, right? And a like low circular thing, which most people describe as a well, but sometimes I hear other descriptions of it, a mirror or something. And that like those are right on this side of the gate, and then the land of the dead, and they are in some way connected with like fate and memory.
Mm-hmm.
And then on the other side of that, like if you go right past that, there's the gate or a bridge or whatever onto like, or a ferry, and then into the land of the dead from there. But there's actually another way into the land of dead, which is terrible. there's like cliffs of pain you can scale, basically.
Sounds
And
very much like
probably-
Hellraiser. I'm loving it.
Yeah, and like probably other entrances too, but like those are the, as far as I know, those are the only two ways in and out. There's like a nice gate that like sort of requires permission.
Yeah.
And then there's also like these terrible cliffs of pain that you can try and climb. I don't recommend that. So I guess that is my generic experience of the underworld. I will say I didn't realize this for a long time. I imagine that that is deeply informed by Ursula Le Guin's Wizard of Earthsea series, which I read when I was quite young. And I didn't put that together because Ursula Le Guin's depiction of the underworld is very closely modeled on Mesopotamian mythological like understandings of the world of the dead. So I didn't put together for a while that like maybe those books I read as over and over and over until they fell apart. I read those books as kids.
Wow.
Like particularly Tombs of Atuan. Like I do think that like my internal landscape, I think everybody's internal landscape is informed by everything they consume.
I wholly agree.
If you read carefully, right? Like accounts of the underworld from like Mesopotamia or from Greece or from like Northern Europe, they seem very different. But like if you think about like their underlying geometry, they're actually very similar. And that's what I mean about, oh, it's a tall cylinder. Is it a tower? Is it a tree? But like when you sort of, at least for me, when I really like get into like the geography of the underworld, seems pretty culturally similar, but like all the cultures I mentioned are connected cultures, right? Does it look the same in sub-Saharan Africa or like in Chinese mythology? I don't know. Tibetan mythology, it kind of does. But again, there's like this continuous, I mean, cultures, I think cultures in the world are much more connected much earlier in history than we
I agree. Yeah.
give credit to, even in the Americas, even in Australia. Do you know what I mean? Like even in those more isolated places.
Right.
You know, I mean, like Europe, Africa, and Asia, you can walk around them.
Yeah.
Like there's a land route from sub-Saharan Africa to like northern Mongolia. Like it's long and terrible, but there's a land route. You know, and similarly from like, you know, Iraq to Norway, you can just walk.
Right.
I mean,
just follow the coastline.
Like, theoretically, a person can walk. You know what I mean? And I think the more history I study, the more I believe that geography is destiny, right? So like, why is Egypt so amazing? Because it sits like a tick at the mouth of the Nile. There's like in all the riches of Africa in both a like ecological sense, like the silt, the fertile silt from the entire continent, like half of Africa flows into that delta, but also like trade goods and information. Like there's only one land route out of Africa. You go through Egypt and then you go through the Sinai Peninsula. So like that's why everybody's fighting over the Sinai Peninsula. Like I don't want to like overgeneralize, but I'm saying like I feel like if you look at a map, you start to understand a lot about how cultures move in.
Yeah, without a doubt.
Yeah, and I think the same would be true of the underworld if we had bodies that could experience that geography in an unmediated way.
Interesting
like our
point.
bodies, you know what I mean? Like our sense that the world is like three-dimensional and I mean, not even Euclidean. Like nothing about the world we live in is Euclidean, actually. It's just like we were taught to see it that way. But even the three-dimensionality, like that's a feature of human anatomy and not a feature of the universe. Like it's just the way we experience it, right? Like our sensory access to it. And I just don't think that's, so when we're out of our body, we have this other like crazy experience that is not being mediated by the senses, but our, like as people, our senses, like that's the only way we know how to see.
Yeah.
Right. And I'm saying even with years and years of specialized training, and I'm better at this even than other people in my PhD math program were. Like, you know, there are not many, maybe so many people in the world who both do that math and drop a lot of acid and travel shamanically to the other worlds. And I do feel like those experiences knit together in a very coherent way. But like even me with all of that experience, like it's still baffling to me. Like, what does the underworld look like? Who fucking knows, right? Like, it's weird though. what does it say in the Descent of Inanna? The ways of the underworld are strange, but altogether just.
Yeah, it's wild.
That is my experience of the underworld. And I think that concept, right, is really my sort of guiding light when it comes to Ereshkigal. So for me, here's the way that story goes. Ishtar, the petty and terrible queen of heaven and earth, is angry because Gilgamesh won't fuck her. And she goes to daddy and she's like, daddy, we have to murder this guy. And he's like, okay, princess. And he takes Ereshkigal's husband, the bull of heaven, and like, go fight this guy. And Gilgamesh murders him. So I want to be clear, this story starts with Ishtar getting her sister's husband murdered. That's the frame of this story, right? Ishtar then uses the pretense of his funeral to invade the underworld because she is the queen of heaven and earth, but she would like to be the queen of heaven and earth and the underworld, right? And that does not go well for her, right? So she's going down, and in all these stairs, right, she has to like remove her vestments of power, right? She has to divest herself of her privilege to even make it into the underworld, right? Because the ways of the underworld are strange and altogether just. And I think this is really okay, I don't want to say like the moral of the story. There are a lot of morals of every story.
Right.
But something I really get out of this story is that even like this terrible, unfair power structure that exists on Earth, it's bullshit. And death is the great leveler. Like it lays even the mighty low, right? That even Ishtar isn't a queen when she gets down there, right? So she gets down there and she finds Ereshkigal, and Ereshkigal is not having this, right? And she kills her sister and hangs her on a hook, right? But then nothing on Earth can be born, right? Because Ishtar, like in the same way that Ereshkigal like midwifes us into death, like Ishtar is she's not a mother goddess, but she is like the great vagina of the world, the great passage of the world, right? And like, you know what I mean? Like when souls are born into the world, they're definitely coming through birth passage into the world, right? I understand it, right? And so nothing on Earth can be born, right? So people, and blah, 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 blah. Like there's a long, complex story here that isn't the part of the story I want to tell. But people come down and they find Ereshkigal moaning because she's in labor and she can't deliver either, and she has to be rescued and blah, blah, blah. But I really understand the like core of that story, right? To be that like the ways of the underworld are strange. They are strange to us, but they are altogether just. And what that means is like kings and queens, fuck that noise. Like, right? That like in death, we are all made equal, right? And that like Ereshkigal is that force, right? That in Greece we would call Nemesis, right? The one that like people are afraid of Nemesis, but only terrible people should be afraid of Nemesis. Like she's the one who evens the scales. You know what I mean? Hubris is not a sin that normal people can commit. Hubris is a sin of kings, right? Like that's not like normal people cannot engage. Like it's not even possible. Like what does it mean to compare yourself to a god? They don't mean like, oh, I think my weaving is good as Athena. Like that's a story you tell children because they're not allowed to say, that king who compares himself to God, that's the real enemy. But they're not allowed to tell that story, so they gotta like tell it between the lines. And to me, like that's the core, I think, of that myth. There are a lot of other things. I mean, I don't know, maybe I'm just feeling political today. There are a lot of other morals in that story too, but I do think that like that phrase, that the ways are strange but altogether just, I think that's what they're saying. Talk a little bit about PGM, which I see on your bookshelf behind you. Lovely tableau, right? So the Greek Magical Papyri, okay, we call them Greek because they're in the Greek language. They are primarily from Egypt, right? Which at that point is a Greek colony. And toward the later end, like a Roman colony. Again, I'm going to assume that viewers of this channel know this, but I'm going to say it because I feel like an astonishing number of people do not understand this. There are 2 Roman empires, right? So like after Julius Caesar dies, like some shenanigans happen, but ultimately like at that point, the empire really splits into 2, right? Like Western Rome, which is Europe, right? And Eastern Rome, which is everywhere I give a shit about. Like Egypt, Greece, Mesopotamia, like the civilized world, right? And that cultural divide, like even though politically that those were unified briefly, like culturally they were always different. And the Eastern Roman Empire always spoke Greek, right? Like Latin. I'm not saying nobody there spoke Latin, but the like language of that empire is Greek. And so that's why the Greek magical papyri are in Greek, but they're from Egypt. They're kind of like a random collection of magical texts, right? So like if you were in Egypt in late antiquity, that would not be one book. It's just like a bunch of different things put together. And they really range the gamut from like very highly literate sort of like Egyptian priestcraft, right? And Hebrew magic, right? Like there's a lot of the Greek magical papyri are clearly Jewish in origin. Like they're all Jewish names, and they're stylistically quite Jewish, right? There's the Egyptian kind, and there's also this Greek kind, and then there's like other stuff mixed in, right? And they get collected together. Okay, so we have these Greek magical papyri, and Ereshkigal's name is like all over them. Something I notice when I read the PGM is that there's like this coherent goddess throughout the PGM that is sometimes described as Hecate, and sometimes Ereshkigal, and sometimes Persephone, and sometimes Selene, the moon, like sometimes some other things. And oftentimes in the same spell, like just a list of those names, but not always one of them. And like, even though in other contexts, like Hecate and Persephone and Artemis and Selene are clearly quite different, in the PGM, they are clearly talking about like one coherent thing, which I just think of as like the witch queen. Honestly, I don't know that much about Egypt, but if I found out that was Isis, I wouldn't be shocked. Like, I think it's maybe a face of Isis, but I don't know from Egypt so much. And Ereshkigal is one of the names that is used there, right? So her name is used most prominently in conjunction with Hecate, right? But also sometimes with others of those names. But what they are talking about is clearly one thing. Like there's clearly a person, like a divine personage that they are talking about, right? That they are using a bunch of different names for. And also, like, you have to remember that for most of the, at least many of the people writing those texts, Greek is not their native language.
Correct.
Right? Like that's their like fancy colonial language that like
the lingua franca of its time.
Yeah, and that's like the language that like they learned in school, and they were beaten whenever they used their native language, I assume. just like everywhere else that gets colonized, like just like in the Americas, right? Like indigenous people were put in reservation schools and beaten when they used their own language. I assume that also happened in Greek colonized Egypt. I think that's just a mechanism of colonization. Right? So like, and it shows in the Greek, I will say, like as a person who does read ancient Greek, if you read it, some of them you can be like, oh, well, this is not this first person's first language. I mean, it's not my first language either, but I can tell the difference between like Homer and somebody who is marginally literate in Greek, you know? And so that's what I think. I think that there is a goddess that they are trying to apply this name to. And I think Ereshkigal is one of the names they are trying to apply to this coherent thing. And okay, so now I'm going to veer into like some crazy UPG at this point. So I want to be clear, up to this point, I feel like on solid scholarly footing, like I stand by everything. From here on out, now I'm just talking nonsense, but like it doesn't come from nowhere.
Right.
Right.
And then you have unverified personal gnosis that becomes shared personal gnosis.
Yeah, I mean, at a certain point, a lot of this is now shared by, like, I teach a lot. So much of this is shared by, like, lots of people. But also sometimes it ends up being verified by scholars after I say it. Like, I do tell the future for a living. I'm just saying, it doesn't come from nowhere. But I also think that, like, mythopoetics, like just like I said, like, you know, I retold the story of Ishtar's descent in a very different way than it is often told. Like I think many people think of that as a hymn to Ishtar, but I understand that story to be a hymn to Ereshkigal.
Yeah.
Ereshkigal's the good guy in
Well,
this.
it's interesting that you mention that because at the very end of the descent,
Exactly.
it says, Ereshkigal, it is sweet to praise you. So,
Right. And a lot of people say that that's just like a lot of scholars, especially scholars who aren't magicians, will write this context that they're like, they're just saying that because they're afraid of Ereshkigal and they like don't want her to be mad at them. But like, I find Ishtar much more terrifying than Ereshkigal. Ereshkigal is like the bone white mother of compassion who like washes away the pain of incarnation with her tears. Like, you know what I mean? Like I'm not saying she's not also terrible. Like she will definitely hang you on a hook if you like, I'm just saying, like, I think she has a bad reputation that is
yeah. In my
mostly
own personal experience,
yeah.
I've had experiences with her where it was deeply profound and emotional, and yes, very much in the presence of I would refer to her as in a very Marian way as Our Lady of Sorrows. That was the experience that I had with her. But then in another experience that I had with her, which was unfortunately by happenstance, I was in a ritual setting, and one of the individuals who was actively participating in this ritual called upon her, but in a very laissez-faire manner. And in that moment, before they could finish, I felt like my entire body had been tightened on a spring, and this great black thing came into the room like a giant bird and just hovered in the corner, glowering. And at
I've
the end of
actually
that,
had
I was like, I'm done.
I've had a quite similar experience, and I had the opposite reaction. I just cut them off. I like stopped them, and I just took over. And I like, oh, but they don't mean it, Ereshkigal, blah 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 blah, avert. You know what I mean? And yeah, I have had a similar experience, but my personal experience with her, she has always been like kind and wonderful. I
Mm-hmm.
will say my experience with her is really rooted in like my experience of grief. Right.
Yes.
So my very beloved, like I was very close with my parents. They were killed in a car accident in 2012. And that ushered in like really, I would say almost in ways that truthfully, I am just now in the last honestly 6 months starting to like resolve in some
Wow.
ways. I mean, like, yeah, I'm just saying it was a transformative experience for me. Like, I closed my heart down after that in a way that I have only recently started open again. But like, I also like that's when I really like my work with Ereshkigal and with Persephone both, right? Who I again do not think of as interchangeable, but I understand Persephone and Ereshkigal to be much more closely related than Ereshkigal and Hecate
Mm-hmm.
personally. Like in that like triumph in that complex that I just call Witch Queen. Like I call that the thing that in the PGM I'm talking about, I call that the Witch Queen, right? Or sometimes the Crocopeplos, like she of the Crocopeplos. Like when she's like a more celestial avatar. Like I generally call the chthonic aspect Witch Queen and the celestial aspect Crocopeplos, but those all get mixed together. Like, yeah, my experience of that is really sort of rooted in that period of grief. Like I'm gonna tell a story that is about Persephone and not Ereshkigal, but that's because it's happening in Greece. So shortly after my parents died, which was terrible, but I will say, like, when your parents are run over by a truck, it does come with a relatively large insurance settlement.
Wow.
Yeah. I mean, which changed my life in a lot of ways. Like my ability to like quit my job as a teacher and do this. Like I didn't like inherit like I don't need a job kind of money, but I did inherit like I can start a business. I basically it's not inherited. I mean, it was an insurance settlement, right? Enough money to basically pay off my student loans and buy a very cheap house in a highly distressed neighborhood that I share with like 3 roommates, right? And it let me basically like take a year and like transition from teaching high school to, I mean, administering and teaching high school at that point to like being self-employed, right? But it also paid for me to take a trip to Greece, which I had never been to before. On that trip, we went to Eleusis, which is the seat of the Eleusinian mysteries, right? Modern Elefsina. So that's like the cult center of Persephone, right? And so on this trip to Greece, it's during the currency crisis. So like
Ooh,
a lot, like the
yikes.
sites in Athens, I mean, it was interesting. It was an interesting time to be there. And it wasn't like, in my opinion, Athens during a currency crisis is less dangerous than many American cities. Like, I think sometimes the American media makes it seem like, ooh, everywhere's all scary, but actually, America is fucking terrifying. Like, it's not like they're, you know, nobody's open carrying weapons in Athens, even during a crisis. And that I cannot say for places that I have lived in America. But so in Athens, like all the sites were like, I mean, not closed, but like there were armed guards everywhere and like velvet ropes. And like I got kicked out of more than one site for declaiming Orphic hymns in Greek. And we all on our trip like learned to pretend to trip and spill our water because you weren't allowed to pour offerings.
Oh my gosh.
Really pretending to trip to spill our water. But okay.
Just a bus tour of clumsy people.
Right, exactly. I mean, ugh, old ladies, what are you gonna do? So, but in Eleusis, which is like only an hour outside Athens, so I don't really know why more tourists don't go there. It's amazing. Like, it's a great site. It's, you know, it's not stupendously well preserved, but like there's a lot of visible ruins. And it really becomes clear the like geography of the site. So there's 3 gates of initiation in the Eleusinian mysteries, and there's like 3 physical gates that you can walk through to Eleusis. And I did that very, very intentionally. And I, you know, I'd had a decades-long relationship with Persephone before this, right? But I very intentionally walked through those gates. And when you get inside, like in the inner courtyard, there's a cave called the Plutonian Cave, which is legendarily like the cave where Persephone arises from the underworld in the spring. Well, if you have eyes to see, there's like clearly a gateway to hell there. Like if you look in that cave, you're like, oh, that's hell down there. I've been there. I know what that looks like. Okay. And there's no guards or anything, right? And there's nobody there but our tour group, right? And there's like a shelf inside the cave. So like here's the sort of hell mouth over. I know hell mouth has like such a terrible connotation in English, but I mean that's just I don't mean it in a bad way. I'm saying like as a devotee of hell, that's where that is a gate to. Like takes one to know one, you know what I mean? Okay, so like over here, and then there's this shelf in the cave here. So I just climbed up on top of that shelf and had what was in fact the most transformative spiritual experience I have ever had. I can't even communicate what happened. I will say that I'm told from the outside what happened is I wept like a little baby for like an hour on that shelf. And the woman who I had just met on this trip named Caroline Kenner, who now I think of as like my witchy godmother, was the one who told the other people like, hey, yo, she's okay. Let's just let her do her thing. For which I am very grateful because I was okay and I needed time to do my thing. But I came out of that experience just like freed from my fear of death and with an unshakable faith in the reality of reincarnation. Right? And I think that what I like about Persephone, right, is that she retains this dual character, right? Whereas like in Mesopotamia, Ishtar and Ereshkigal are like put at odds with one another, largely in service to like a newly rising imperial patriarchy, right? Like the, you know, Enheduanna, who from whom we like learn a lot of about Ishtar, like that's the, at least metaphorically, the daughter of Sargon the Great. Like she has fully sold out to imperial patriarchy. Like,
right, she's essentially the female pope who was put into power to ease the tensions between the Sumerian people and their Akkadian conquerors and colonizers. But yeah, she's an agent of the state.
Right, and that's true about this is what I was saying about like a lot of mythology. You have to read it. It's in addition to all the other things it's also very clearly political propaganda, right? So like in Greece, like if you read the differences between Homer and Hesiod, those are political differences. Right.
And you know, it's interesting that you do mention the political aspect of it, because there is evidence in some translations, and this is actually something that a friend and colleague of mine, Steffi Von Scott, has been pursuing, in the sense that Inanna, in the Descent of Inanna myth, she does sit upon the throne of Ereshkigal, And it is theorized that in that moment she does take the powers of the underworld into herself. There are actually other anecdotal details about that, which is why she does have the power to break the doors between heaven and earth and bring up the dead to outnumber the living. And what's also interesting is Cutha, the city where Ereshkigal was worshipped, compared to Inanna, Ereshkigal has about as many temple centers or temple presences as you can count on one hand. Inanna, or Ishtar, had over 180.
Well, that's because
So
rich people love sky gods and rich
exactly.
people love temples.
And you've also got her as the deity who legitimizes kings. So
Right.
there's that aspect. And I'm going on a tangent here, but
no,
you know,
you're not. This is exactly what I'm saying. This is not a tangent.
As power was reconsolidated and changed hands, and kingship literally went from city to city, we do find that eventually Cutha, as the city of Ereshkigal, is eventually rededicated to Nergal, who is then installed as her husband. And you know, we do have the myth where she is describing herself. I mean, she is described as a beautiful maiden who has never seen the sunlight. And so she is essentially a cloistered individual. And I think if we were to look at myth through a cultural lens, and especially how we know that in later antiquity, Assyrian women were cloistered from men, I firmly believe that in looking at these myths, we see how noble women were actually treated, or how they, you know, composed themselves, how they carried themselves in antiquity, because we read that Ereshkigal is given to the underworld as its bride. She has never seen the day. She doesn't know play as maidens do. So she is essentially a cloistered bride in her bower, who is not let out to, you know, see the city, take in the sights. So we then have this instance where the emissary from heaven descends into the underworld, announces that there's going to be a banquet. Exactly. However, Ereshkigal cannot attend this banquet.
She's not allowed to leave, right?
Exactly, because here's an interesting bit, and it's later elaborated upon in this myth of Ereshkigal and Nergal. In order for her to ascend from the underworld, someone has to take their seat upon her throne.
Exactly.
So she sends her emissary Namtar to the heavens to attend this banquet, to receive these offerings, this, you know, the meal, the sacred meal, and take it back to the underworld. While he's there, however, Nergal, one of the astral deities, who's also a war deity, he's also described as the god of peace, because if you give him that epithet, he's going to ensure that peace is maintained in your city. So we have Nergal, who does not stand in the presence of Ereshkigal's emissary, who is acting in her stead. And as a result, she finds out about this, and, you know, some chaos ensues, and he descends into the underworld and commands, you know, his legions of demons to slaughter every gatekeeper. He then seizes her by the neck and the hair and throws her to the ground, and, you know, claims the underworld as his own. But she says, wait a minute, don't kill me, you know, let's seal the deal with some sweet love. And after 7 days and 7 nights of immeasurable bliss and passion, he goes back to heaven, and she finds that in the process, she's essentially going to be in the eyes of society, a fallen woman who has been, you know, deflowered as a virgin and has not been given the honor of being made a bride. So, as we find with Inanna and Ishtar, she states that if Nergal is not given to her, if he is not made to account for his deeds, that she's going to unleash the denizens of the underworld so that they will
right?
outnumber the living. And I just
What a
think that that is
badass.
so
I love it.
fascinating. So then we
I
have this power play, and he comes to the underworld and he's installed as its king. And
mhm.
eventually, over time, Ereshkigal is, she doesn't wane in power, she maintains her
Right.
presence as a figurehead, but all of the action, if you will,
On Earth, yeah, exactly.
is manifested by him as the god of inflicted death. And then,
Exactly.
she doesn't last that long in terms of cultural identity or cultural memory, and then she filters her
And
way
she
into
does.
the
You know what I
PGM.
mean? Like yeah, like she does maintain that presence. And in my opinion, you know who she retains, like who retains memory of her? Anybody who's been in the underworld and come back,
Hmm.
which is, in my opinion, like the central initiation of being a mage. You know what I mean? Is you descend below and rise again. If you have been to the underworld and come back alive, you're a fucking wizard.
Yeah, that
Like, I'm
alchemical
not saying there are
transformation.
many other ways to get witched, right? But that, which in my circle we would call being hellborn, like is a very traditional way to be witched. You know what I mean? And I think that's why like she retains a position in the Greek Magical Papyri, right? Because if you've been in the underworld, you don't fall for that propagandist shit.
Yeah.
I'm gonna show you something else that like this is super UPG that I am in no way suggesting is real history, but I want to show you. I believe that like once upon a time, right, what we might call like Ereshkigal and Ishtar, that's one figure, right, that is being like pitted against itself for political reasons by men,
Mhm.
right? And I once saw a picture of that goddess, which I would like to show to you. So this is a statue unearthed at Çatalhöyük, which is a very early Neolithic site in,
Oh, you recently posted about
yeah,
this.
it's been on my mind a lot, right? So this is like I've thought about it a long time, but I really want a statue. So this is a statue. She's she's broken. She's missing her head. Was
Mhm.
she intentionally broken? Unclear, right? But you can see she's like this fat Willendorf kind of Ishtari vibe in the front,
Yeah.
and then she's a skeleton in the back. Right. So
Interesting.
Çatalhöyük is a very early Neolithic site in Anatolia. And so like I'm not saying this is exactly Ereshkigal, but I am saying that like there is a coherence between that figure, right? Also recovered at Çatalhöyük is what is normally called the goddess of Çatalhöyük, which is like people have probably seen it. It's that fat Neolithic, Paleolithic goddess, the one on the lion throne,
Mhm.
right? Who is unquestionably like turns into like Kibele and Cybele and Rhea and eventually
Yeah.
Hera. And you can tell because of the iconography,
Right.
right? They retain that like lion throne iconography, which I have heard suggested is an astrological iconography. I'm I don't want to say I'm sus about that opinion. I'm unconvinced. I feel like people who worship sky gods are really keen to put their sky gods everywhere. And that was
You
true
know, I
opinion.
I
It's
will
still
have
true among
to agree.
astrologers I know. Like they seem like they're always like, oh, Ereshkigal is actually the moon. And I'm like, I assure you she is fucking
She
not
is
the moon.
not.
She's in the underworld and not in the sky. That's how I can tell. like but there's certainly a kinship there, right? And I think one of the reasons I really like Persephone as a face for this like thing that we're talking about is I feel like Persephone in some way retains that, right? Like because she herself goes up and down, right? Like Persephone in the spring. Oh, I was telling this Eleusis story, right? So I had this
Mhm.
transformative experience of Eleusis. I went back to Greece like 2 years later by myself. So I was staying in Athens and I was going out to Eleusis, right? So I was just going to take the bus to Eleusis. Now, first of all, if you just take the like city bus to Eleusis, you actually follow almost exactly the ancient processional way.
Interesting.
Like that's just how the bus route goes, right? But also literally everyone I spoke to in Athens, the concierge at the hotel, and like my Greek has gotten better at this point in the story, so I'm talking to more people, right? And I'm traveling by myself, right? Instead of with a group of Americans, right? But the concierge at the hotel, the like cabbie, the kid at the grocery store that I just made talk to me because I was bored and lonely and I don't like traveling by myself, okay, and it's February at this point. Now, February in Athens is not like February in Pittsburgh.
Mhm.
Like it's not cold, but it's winter. I mean, it's gray and chilly, and I'm wearing a coat, right? every single person, in fact, it was February 18th, because it's right before my birthday, so I happen to know what it was. Like, every single person I spoke to was like, oh, in Elefsina, which is the modern name for Eleusis, it will already be spring. Right? Because again, this is where Persephone arises in the spring, like mythologically, is through that cave. Well, when I got to Elefsina, like to Eleusis, that is 100% true. Like, poppies were fully bloomed, not like bud. I mean, in Athens, it was definitely still the tail end of winter. Like, some trees had buds, but nothing was blooming yet. It was February, right? But now I'm seeing poppies everywhere. And that was when I really started to understand that like spring doesn't come early in Eleusis because Persephone rises there. Like, spring comes early there, and it came early there before humans learned to talk, right? Like, before humans existed, before Persephone existed, and like with a name that humans gave her, like as a feature of the microclimate of Eleusis. Right?
Yes.
But Persephone like retains that power, right? She is not only like the murderess who like drags souls down to hell, right? And like the one who like, you know, makes like, she pushes seeds up from the below to make them blossom, right? And she pushes flowers into fruit, and she's the one who drags, like, a fruit falls down and decays, and that's her too. And like the secret of hot compost, I believe to be one of the mystery secrets of Eleusis. That's not as crazy as it sounds. There's like a specific ritual where you like throw immolated pigs in a pit, and then you dig them up later and spread them on fields, and you throw down specific other like nitrogen and carbon laced things in proportion. Like, hot composting is a thing they're doing at Eleusis. I think it's a technology invented at Eleusis.
Interesting.
Yeah, and so like Persephone, I think like she's that flower maiden, right? And we don't talk about that face of Persephone, but it's still there, right? And that's, so to me, like that goddess that I showed, who's like fat and fertile in the front and a skeleton in the back, and I imagined her like, she spins and like lights on fire and her flesh falls off and she's a skeleton, and then she spins and her flesh comes back. And again, total UPG at this point, right? Like, I wish I was like a painter so I could like share that image with people, but I only make words, so that's like the best I can do. Like, and to me, like Ereshkigal and Ishtar are locked in that same, like, there's this political thing that has like ripped them apart. Right? But when we say they're sisters, like, I actually understand them at root to be this same force, like the great cycle of life. Like, growing up in America, I was taught, I think most of us were taught about like a food chain, which is so fucking ridiculous. There's a food cycle. Like, there's a whole other half of it that happens under the ground that we just don't talk about. And that, like, that's what I think of as Persephone. That's what I think of as Ereshkigal, is like the bottom, like Ereshkigal, I think of the bottom half of that cycle. And so like in my practice also, she is like deeply and intimately connected with composting, a thing I find like endless spiritual joy. And like, my favorite thing to garden is dirt. I love growing dirt out of compost. I actually like it even more than the other parts of gardening, because I'm a weird hellborn weirdo, I guess. Anyway, that's all stuff that like I think about Ereshkigal. Okay, so in the PGM, right, she's in this witch queen role, right? And she gets called on in a variety of ways, right? So the PGM, it's really interesting to see how, you know, the gods they call on for certain kinds of magic like seem a little weird. Like, there's a lot of love spells.
Love spells. We really need to
rape spells, like that are like basically
incel spells.
Yeah, that like you just curse people, and like, but even still, you'd think like Persephone and Ereshkigal would be like a weird choice there. Like, it's weird to call on that goddess for that spell, but like, you know what I mean? Like, she occurs in all different kinds of locations, because I really think she's genuinely understood, like, that goddess, right, who is Ereshkigal, but only sort of Ereshkigal. It's also Hecate and Persephone and Selene, and like, it's not really any of those. It's some other goddess who might be Heka. There's an Egyptian goddess called Heka that I know again, I really don't know from Egypt so much, right? But there's definitely like a sometimes female goddess, sometimes male god, right, of magic itself, right, called Heka. And I actually suspect that might be what they're talking about, and that's why she's all over, right? Because in Ereshkigal, it's less clear than it is in like some other goddesses in that same category. But like Underworld, like, that's a witch queen, you know what I mean? Like what I'm saying about like descending and rising being the mark of a magician, like, that was also true in Mesopotamia. You really have to kind of read between the lines to see it. So I do think that probably Ereshkigal, like in ancient Mesopotamia and the ancient Near East more broadly, right, was probably a lot more popular with freaky weirdo magicians than she was. Like, I think she has a type.
What's interesting is the two figures that are instrumental in resurrecting Inanna or Ishtar, the the Kurgara. I almost had a brain fart there. The Kurgara and the Gala or the Galatura. What's interesting is they are distinctly associated with liminal acts.
Exactly.
One of them being, and I found in my own research more so the Kurgara, in the sense that they are considered or were considered practitioners of malevolent magic.
Yeah.
And
by
they
which they
were
need magic that the king doesn't approve of.
exactly. And they were the ones who were essentially associated with these funerary rites. So
in
you
Greek,
know,
we call those funeral rites goetia, or wailing. That's an old lady you hire to wail at your funeral.
And the Gala or the Galatura, they, were the lamentation priests. So
exactly. And like
they go hand in hand.
And that's also at least, like, I mean, at least in ancient Greece, but also in becoming rapidly less so in modern Greece. But that is an ongoing tradition, and that woman is definitely a sorceress. I mean, again, that's what the word Goetia means, right? Is that job, right? Like, which is also used for sorcery. And that's why I think it's not so unusual that like Ereshkigal is the one who's in the PGM, because she's our goddess, like she's our beloved queen of witches.